Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Folks that are joining us late can join us late. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Navigating a New Reality. We are fortunate today to be joined by Jay Schlinsog, Principal of Downtown Professionals Network and creator of Reopen Main Street. He's presenting to us today from Franklin, Tennessee. We also have Randy Wilson of Community Design Solutions, who's presenting to us today from Columbia, South Carolina. I would also like to welcome our Main Street colleagues from neighboring states of South Dakota and Kansas. We're really glad that you're joining us today. We also want to welcome all of our Nebraska Main Street communities, as well as our network member communities and our partner members today. Thank you for being a part of your webinar series. This programming is provided to you as members of the network to strengthen your capacity for success as dedicated downtown professionals. For those of you from communities that are not members, we encourage you to join the network. For more information on how you can join, please visit our website at www.nebraskamainstreet.org. Couple of housekeeping items before we start. We want to make this a very casual and relaxed program and want everyone to feel that they're a part of the conversation. Please do ask questions. If you have questions during the program, feel free to use the chat function on the bottom of your screen. If you've not used Zoom before, you can access it if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the page where you can see some menus. The chat button looks like a conversation bubble if you haven't seen that before. Click on it and you'll see a pop-up box where you can type in your questions. We'll do a more formal Q&A at the end of the presentations. Please go ahead and make sure you're muted if you're not asking a question as part of the discussion portion of the webinar so that we don't get any unnecessary feedback. If anyone has a problem or a technical issue during the presentation, please email me at echase@windstream.net or send me a text at 402-499-3703. We have our trusted friend, as always, from Southeast Community College, Luke, who is on with us today to help with anything just in case something happens. We'd like to thank SCC for being our partner for these webinars. They've actually been with us since when we first started offering these distance training opportunities for all of you. The presentation today will provide a timely inside perspective on possible strategies and practical ideas to help small businesses, community leaders, and organizations advance COVID-19 recovery efforts and navigate a new reality. We hope you all had a chance to check out the Reopen Main Street website and are prepared to join in the discussion as Jay and Randy share examples and ideas that can help fuel your district's path to recovery. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn the honors over to Jay, who will kick us off today with his wealth of wisdom.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. Very kind. Hello, Nebraska. Wonderful to be joining you today. I'm going to try to do this switch over here because I have a lot to share in a short amount of time. So let's see if we can make this happen. And voila. I love it when technology works. Again, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules. I'm just going to jump in. I've got a lot to share in a short amount of time here. I'm excited to share some examples with you as well. Reopen Main Street started as a special project just about 2 months ago. And it's been special on so many different levels than we ever imagined at the time. Over that time, we've had a chance to touch downtowns, business districts, moreover, people in all 50 states in the District of Columbia. And I share that because we have, I'm guessing, some of you that are joining us today to thank for that as well, with 118 users strong coming to us from Nebraska. A couple of things as we jump in. These are ideas. This actually grew out of some notes that I was making in some notebook pages and a prompting of a phone call just about 2 months ago. And one of the questions was, can you share with us Do you have any ideas for proven strategies? And my response was, I'm not sure there are any because this is just so new to us. So what we're sharing are ideas. Now, the good news is that being a little bit further along, and especially down here in the South, having a little bit of a timeline of 2-3 weeks of reopening under our belts, I do have some real examples to share that I hope you'll enjoy as well. Along that same line, when we say they're ideas, they're exactly that. Uh, the very best guidance, of course, for Nebraska comes from Nebraska. And so uh, as you're thinking about ideas and how they might apply to you, of course, we want you to consider that within the context or the framework of those guidance documents and guidelines and laws that are in place in Nebraska to help guide you through the different recovery phases. The website, as I mentioned, launched just about 2 months ago. We're doing our best to try to keep it fresh, to add some examples along the way. The way that we've organized it is to provide ideas and suggestions for both businesses and for community leaders and organizations. If you had a chance to dig in, what you found is somewhere approaching 100, maybe more than 100 different ideas and examples that we're sharing. In the short time we have here today, we're not going to dig into each and every one of those 100 plus. But what I thought we could do is share with you some ideas, some examples that fall under three overarching ideas or common threads that run through to give you a taste of what you find as you begin to dig inside. And let's start here, enhancing the comfort level. Quite frankly, I think this is probably the most important, critical piece as we begin this rollout phase, because it considers that as we begin to progress, just because the doors are open again, the lights are on, doesn't mean that we're flipping a switch and consumer behavior is going to change immediately. And I share this example of a survey from Lapeer, Michigan. You can see when asked, once stay-at-home orders are lifted, how long will you wait before dining out or shopping in a small business? And about 38% said, I'm in, I'll start right away. But that means there's about 62% in this example that are going to take a more of a wait and see approach and wait anywhere from a month to more than a month before they rejoin the district. And this study, the results here that you're looking at are very consistent with studies that we've seen in other localities in different parts of the country, where anywhere from about 60 to 70% are going to take more of a wait and see approach before they begin to dine out and before they begin to visit our businesses again. So there are a number of different examples out there of things that we can do to help enhance that comfort level. And if you will, think of it as every message that you can send, every action that you can take to enhance that comfort level could help to minimize the amount of time that people will wait to visit us again. So a number of good examples. If you have a chance, jump on over to the Red Wing, Minnesota website. They just launched within the past 10 days or so a COVID Aware campaign that also includes chances for businesses to tie in and essentially commit to doing some minimal types of things to enhance that comfort level and make sure that we're providing that safe, that comfortable environment for people as they begin to return to our districts. As you're thinking about that too, there are certainly a number of examples out there, including these that we've generated for the Michigan Main Street program. And what we like about these is that it's an image, it's just a few words, but yet it conveys a message in very concise and obvious terms and helps to promote this idea of returning to a place that is going to do everything that they can, they're taking actions, they're sending messages to enhance that comfort level. And this also ties into social distancing. I don't know that any of us were familiar with the term social distancing just even 3 months ago, but it's become a regular part of our vocabulary today. Dr. Birx is one that acknowledged even a couple of months ago that social distancing is going to be with us even as guidelines are eased and even perhaps as they expire. She suggested well through this summer, and I would suggest perhaps even longer. There are some good examples out there, including this from our friends in Iowa, in terms of how we can promote social distancing. I also like some of the ideas, some of the graphics that we're seeing that can be applied in the storefront and even out on the street to help identify what are those social distancing guidelines and distances that we want to respect. But I really like this twist on it too, if you will. From Twisted Barley Brewing Company in Jasper, Alabama, you see that they have literally used kegs to promote social distancing in their establishment during the initial reopening phases. Kudos to them. It's also a chance too, if you will, to help set the expectation for the customer, for the visitor as they begin to return. So I love this example from Florida where we're showing some of those great attractions that people are going to be longing to return to, those familiar places and faces, if you will, but also asking respectfully, when you do come back, please join us in respecting social distancing and good hygiene guidelines. We've talked a lot about visitors, about customers returning back. The part of the equation that we can't forget are those employees, and especially those employees on the front lines. So just really encouraging businesses, take care of your employees. And it's not just in terms of doing your very best to ensure their health and safety on the front line, but even as you're going through the planning phases of what business looks like when we do reemerge, include those employees in your planning phases. Get their input. There's, in many cases, some of the very best ideas are coming from those on the front line. The other benefit of that is that you begin to build this higher sense of ownership and therewith enhance that sense of safety and comfort level of the employee. Also encouraging you and others that we've had a chance to connect with to use this period to experiment as you begin to think about adapting to this new reality. Now, Randy has all kinds of good examples to share with you about how we maximize public space. And there have been many who have suggested that recovery will largely happen in the public spaces. I'm looking forward to Randy's presentation as part of today, probably just as much as anyone else here. So I'm not going to dive in there. Randy is going to cover that much better and in much more detail than I could. But I do want to talk momentarily about events and how that looks different as we progress through these different phases. No doubt it looks different and it's going to feel different. And the challenge for us as people that do Main Street and people that are advocates for downtown, it's so counterintuitive to what we do in Main Street. And consider Rock Springs, Wyoming, front and center on their website. We work hard to make downtown a community gathering place. And it's almost like you have to put this big old asterisk there now, in groups of 10 or less. And granted, those guidelines vary from locale to locale and state to state, but suffice to say that idea of welcoming crowds, especially during these reopening phases, is not one that is likely to be met enthusiastically. So we have seen a number of examples, and I'm sure there are some from Nebraska, of how you all have adapted and began to introduce virtual events. And even as events begin to roll out, we're encouraging, continue to experiment with those virtual events and as things do begin to appear on the street, and maybe that's in the form of small scale events and small scale kinds of entertainment, make sure that you're capturing that as well as part of a live stream so that we might be able to demonstrate to those that are more hesitant to join us again to visit our downtowns, that indeed we are emerging, that there's this new sense of vibrancy that's emerging. A good example of that is what they've done just recently in Huntsville, Alabama, is they rolled out their concert series, but spread it out as smaller 1-2 person entertainment acts at different locations throughout the district, and love how they've done it both physically and with the virtual tip jars as well. Another piece of that, and in my mind, a critical piece, is infusing the arts. And I think you can probably all think of a place, a district, where in many cases it was the arts that might have been the driver of the Renaissance or the revitalization of a district. And in this time we're in, it certainly makes sense that we're thinking about the arts and thinking about how the arts can play a role as we emerge from COVID. And even think of it like this, if you will, as we begin to introduce smaller scale entertainment, smaller scale events, even after the music stops, the art can live on to help tell a story and send a message. I love this mural from South Huntsville, Alabama. Becca, the director there, tells me that this all evolved in a period of about 10 days from the inception of the idea to actually seeing it fully displayed on the side of this building. And what it became very quickly was a favorite backdrop for many of the high school seniors graduating from the high schools there. But we can also use art again to tell a message, to send a message and to tell a story. And we need to seize on that as we think about how we communicate and how we again welcome people back, but also um, let them know it's okay to join at your own pace. But while you're here, we're going to treat you to this rather organic kind of entertainment, this vibrant emergence that comes with small scale entertainment, events, and art. One note as you are thinking about rolling out events again, the CDC's website has a long list and guidance for how to proceed, how to roll those out as you plan for the months ahead. And do be sure that you're illustrating that experience downtown or your district actually coming back to life. The key here is show the actions that you're taking, that businesses are taking to help welcome people back. And if you will, set that expectation as well. Um, Make sure that you're demonstrating that, yes, we might have been closed for a little while, but there's this newfound energy that one can enjoy, and use all of the different medium, all of the different tools that are available to you to help communicate that message and capture those images again of familiar places and familiar faces and just those famous scenes. I'm convinced that again, people are longing for this. They're longing to return to this place that they recall and these experiences that they had in the past as some sense of, of returning to at least some level of normalcy. And finally, I want to talk about opportunities. And yes, there are opportunities, and we're already seeing opportunities emerging from this mess. But before we do that, we have to be realistic. Um, and some have suggested that this is kind of in your face, rather bold, but the fact of the matter is not all businesses will survive. And let me just share this perspective with you. Even in the best of times and in the most vibrant of our districts in any given year, we see that there are businesses come and businesses go. And it only makes sense, especially when you think about COVID-19 and the impacts that it's had on us, that there will be those opportunities as businesses decide to exit the marketplace for new businesses and new uses to join the mix. So this is not new. We're already beginning to see this, and just it seems like every day, every other day perhaps, that we see news about another business that's closing. And when you look at Pier 1 Imports and J.C. Penney's, it's difficult to see a face. Where it really begins to hit home is when you see Vittles just up the road from me here in Brentwood, closing after 20 years, and Big Cat Brewery in northern Michigan closing because of COVID-19. And again, that's when it really begins to hit home. It's not unexpected. Going all the way back to a Brookings article that appeared in early April, it's what really caught my attention to the severity of what we face. Part of that article included a graphic of that just compiled all of the different businesses by that SIC code, the Standard Industry Classification. And I've only shared a slice of that table here with you, but as you look at that, you can see that it includes many of the very types of businesses that populate our districts today. And back in early April, they were all signed an immediate as being an immediate risk. And you can see that those levels varied from an immediate to near term to long term. This is what caught my attention. This is where I began to see the actual faces. I've had the privilege of doing this a long time, and you don't recognize these faces, but you know these people because they're the same kinds of people that are part of your districts that make it that great place. And the idea of them not being part of that fabric moving forward is something that we're all concerned about. And so it really does prompt the need, as we think about opportunities, for thinking about how we can play a role in best providing a helping hand to dig out of that hole, if you will. Part of that, quite simply, is doing much of what we've done in the past, but in some cases, taking it even to another level. So let's start here, that being that hub of district communications. Interestingly enough, there was a recent study. Well, before I go there, let me just say, if you haven't already, make sure that somewhere on your website or somewhere in your social media, there's an easy way for people, for visitors, to access the latest information on the district and how COVID-19 is applying to what might be business hours or different events. Make sure it's easy to find. And I share that as a simple point, but I've had a chance over the past few weeks to visit literally hundreds of different websites from downtown organizations, downtown districts, different business districts, and I'm amazed at how many I have landed on that there's just not even a reference to COVID-19. So make sure you do that today if you have a chance. The other thing I want to mention is that in this era of COVID, we have all become more and more reliant on electronic communications out of necessity. And the very fact that we can share these ideas with you today using this platform is absolutely wonderful. We've had a chance to travel everywhere from Florida to Wyoming in the past couple of weeks, sharing the message. But we don't want that to completely replace the need for personal contact. And in the past, as we've talked about communication strategies, I'm one that advocates for a high touch and high tech blend. In other words, high tech and using all the tools that we've become accustomed to recently, but also having a high touch component. Now, high touch in the era of COVID means something a little bit different, but it's kind of funny, quite frankly, how an old school marketing technique really took hold as part of a post we shared a few weeks back. And all we were suggesting is Show them you care. This could be your members, it could be your clients, it could be your customers. But the old school playbook said make that list of your top 10 or 20 clients or customers or members or supporters and simply pick up the phone and call them. And we've heard back from another number of people that have taken us up on that suggestion and just went on and on about how appreciative the person at the other end of the line was to hear that voice and to actually hear that someone cared and to hear about plans that were underway to welcome them back. Part of that help, that assistance too, comes in simply sharing information on business recovery programs that are out there. Interestingly enough, Main Street America followed up with an earlier survey, and just within the past week or 10 days, released the results of that follow-up survey. Look here, small businesses are turning to Main Street programs more than any other service provider for both technical assistance and as a connector to important survival resources. Wow. I mean, if ever there was a time for you, for Main Street and what we're doing, it's now. It's right now. And I just want to take a moment to say thank you to Elizabeth and to Nebraska Main Street. I had a chance to troll through a number of different sites and came across yours. The work that you are doing to share that information is just phenomenal. I know a number of directors that I've talked with just recently that said it's become a full-time job plus just to wade through all of the information that's out there and try to make heads or tails of what really applies or what's relevant. So the job that Elizabeth and Nebraska Main Street Network is doing is certainly value added. Do be thinking about how to share that. This example from Lake Wales, Florida, I thought was great. It's actually a splash page before you ever enter their website that provides a directory to what might be relevant resources. And certainly there are other examples out there of how Main Street programs and partners in communities have come together, whether it be a $500 grant program underwritten by a local bank in Monroe, Wisconsin, to a patronicity campaign in Saline, Michigan, to a fighting chance fund in St. Petersburg, Florida. There's just a lot of good examples now that we can borrow from. If you are still looking for ideas that might apply to both technical assistance as well as to different funding kinds of assistance, I would encourage you to visit the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. You can see the website address there. Kennedy Smith, who is a former director with the National Main Street Center, has been doing an incredible job of just compiling a list of different programs and resources, not just available at the federal and the state level, but drilling all the way down to the local level. So there's just an almost exhaustive list of different examples. And it may be that even just one or two of those might provide some inspiration for efforts in your own community. One of the things that I'm most excited about in terms of opportunities is what's happening with the entrepreneurial pool that is evolving for a number of different reasons. And I would contend that that pool of entrepreneurial candidates is going to be larger than we've seen in more than 10 years. And there are some examples out there already emerging. This business from Jasper Main Street, Jasper, Alabama, opened in the midst of COVID. And you can see even Maddie, the high school senior in Huntsville, is using the opportunity to expand her cookie business in downtown Huntsville. So think about those tools, those resources, those different programs that are in place. My suggestion is as you look at this list, the more that you can check off, the better position you're in to take advantage of this growing entrepreneurial pool that's evolving. Do want to share one example from Calera, Alabama. I was just there last week and had a chance to meet Deandra, who you see here. Deandra's the proprietor, the entrepreneur behind Creations Galore and More, which is getting ready to open in downtown Calera. One of the cool things about this is this building, the start of a building that you see here, was actually a breezeway. The breezeway is one of those narrow alleys that oftentimes comes from what might be a parking lot located to the rear of the building out to the sidewalk. They're actually doing an infill project here that's all of about 50, maybe 60 square feet. That will be the incubator, the starting place for Deandra and creations and more galore. Some other ideas that we're seeing too that are really innovative, this tiny shops, these boardwalk shops in Batavia, Illinois, is actually an idea that was hatched pre-COVID, but they're in perfect position now as we think about how do we accommodate these entrepreneurs. And in this case, these cute little cottages, all about 40, maybe 50 square feet, are going to be the starting place, the launch pad for entrepreneurs in Batavia, Illinois. And do be ready for investors too. I just updated the language on this slide because up until a few days ago, it said there will be investors looking to capitalize. No, there are investors looking to capitalize. And we know this for a fact. We've talked to some. So make sure that you have information in place that can help them navigate the market and even the development process. So make sure you have some good community information that talks about the community. If you've been through any recent surveys or any planning efforts that would provide guidance for opportunities in your district, make sure that you have that readily accessible, along with a list of properties and spaces available for sale or lease. And do be thinking about how you can help as that navigator, that facilitator for developers and investors to get through that process, and think about how you share that information as well. I love this example from Decatur, Alabama. The website is just very easy to navigate, and the information is right on target for some of the very prospects and developers that we're going to be welcoming even today and as we progress through the different recovery phases of COVID. So as we do move forward, again, if you haven't had a chance to visit us at reopenmainstreet.com, we'd certainly invite you to do that. We've only had a chance here to scratch the surface of a lot of different ideas and examples that we're sharing. For the most up-to-date kinds of examples, as I mentioned earlier, we're doing our best to keep content on the website fresh. It's quite frankly a little bit easier sometimes to share examples though using the Facebook page. So along with Twitter. We're not as strong on Twitter because Jay doesn't really get Twitter. Not that Jay really gets Facebook either sometimes, but if you haven't already, go check us out at Facebook. And if you're so inclined, you can give us a like and join the growing community there. So with that, I am going to turn it over to my friend, Randy.
Thanks, Jay. Let me get the screen here. And Jay, can you confirm that my slide is showing properly on the screen, or somebody?
Hi, it looks good.
Perfect, great. Well, good. Well, for me, good afternoon. For you, good morning, Nebraska. It's great to join you from South Carolina. Again, my name is Randy Wilson. I'm the president of Community Design Solutions here, but probably the point that's most relevant for you all is I serve as the consulting architect to Main Street, South Carolina. There's a bit of irony in the topic I'm addressing today, in the sense that I literally and shockingly, I was hired to talk about design in the context of disaster, period, end of sentence, by Main Street, Alabama over 6 months ago. And the obvious point there is 6 months ago, no one had heard of coronavirus, COVID-19, social distancing, flatten the curve, or any of these other, terms and behaviors that we've had to adopt that are now just commonplace and a part of our operational vocabulary. And so Mary Helmer, the director of Main Street, Alabama, asked if I could address COVID. And to Jay's previous point, I'm like, I could try. I mean, there are no experts in design in the context of COVID because we've never had it before. And so whoever you consider to be your smartest designer he or she, literally like me, has a whopping 3 months of exposure, no pun intended, to design in the context of a viral pandemic. So this slide becomes extraordinarily relevant, and it's relevant to all of us in the Main Street world, and that is there is no pandemic playbook. We are literally writing it today. And so just like Jay, I'm gonna adopt a position of humility to say, these are some best practices based on my experience, and just by way of reminder for those who I don't know, my firm, along with a lot of pretty high profile Main Street people like Ben Muldrow and Trip Muldrow and other team members, we did disaster recovery master plans in 10 Mississippi Gulf Coast communities after Hurricane Katrina, and then we did the same thing in 8 Vermont communities after Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Sandy. And so the point there is there are a certain body of best practices for designing within the context of disaster, but we've never experienced this kind of pandemic. And so I'm going to talk about 3 best practices from that previous experience that I think apply here. And then I'm going to introduce a 4th one, just like Jay did, which is just kind of specific to COVID-related issues. Now, Jay is clearly and obviously smarter than me because he can talk about all 4 points of Main Street. I'm a one-trick pony. I can only talk about design. But I hope the thing that you're going to take away from both of our presentations is practicality. This is not the time to be highfalutin and just trying to be all that. This is the time to just meet tangible needs in the lives of our communities in crisis. So here are my 3 best practices. The first is this: as Main Street programs, we need to map our skills to the needs of our communities in crisis, because we in a time of crisis, people need to know you can help, and you can help with tangible needs. And so, to me, one of the most obvious questions that we need to ask and answer to get at the heart of what we can help our communities with are what are Main Street programs, what are Main Street designers, what are Main Street design committees typically good at or capable of? And I think one of the answers to that is, historically, we've actually been very good at graphic communication. On a number of occasions, Jay alluded to the fact that of consumer behavior and how proper graphics and signage can actually and literally affect human behavior. And of course, we need to look no farther than this graphic right here to know that's true. In my humble opinion, whenever the flattening the curve diagram was disseminated and explained in America, I think it represents the defining moment and the turning point in how we responded. Because prior to this diagram, at least here in South Carolina, it was sort of everybody was hiding and trying to avoid the virus. And as a result, what did we see? We saw this massive hoarding. When this diagram got explained, everybody realized, oh, the issue is not so much if you're going to get or to come in contact with it, because you probably are. The issue is, how do we manage it? And so don't underestimate the importance and the value of graphic design in affecting human behavior. And so that leads us to the practical aspects of our downtowns. I would assume in your communities, whether it's Lincoln or Omaha or other communities in Nebraska, just like here in Columbia, South Carolina, your downtowns are probably proliferated with this kind of what I'm calling transactional directional signs. Our restaurants and retailers are having to do business differently, and so they're having to tell us, where do we park? Do we open the doors on the windows? Do we get out of the car? Do we stay in? I mean, all of this stuff is really important information in order for us to know how to navigate doing business as our businesses are reopening. Now, I introduced these 2 slides, this slide kind of for both some humor on the left, but then on the right, you can see this is a building that used to be a gas station that's been converted into one of my very, very favorite restaurants. And the problem is look at how they've handled the signage. They've written it all on the windows, which is great if you're walking up to the doors, but what are we doing in this climate? We're driving. And so you can hardly even read the instructions from where you currently have to navigate the experience. Now, here's my whole point in all of this. As Main Street people, we probably are more loyal and more dedicated to supporting our downtown merchants and restaurateurs and retailers than the general public at large. And I've had experiences that were smooth as silk, and I've had others that were really frustrating. Imagine if that happens to somebody who doesn't share a Main Street downtown ethic. what we may be ending up doing is robbing our restaurants and retailers of repeat customers. And so one of the things I'm recommending to our Main Street member communities is to conduct a sign audit. And by a sign audit, I don't mean anything complicated. I mean literally just drive in your downtown, pretend you were going to shop at this pizza place or at that restaurant, and see if you can figure out clearly how you would navigate that experience. And if you can, commend them. And if you can't, in a very humble way, suggest improvements. But more importantly, especially if, I'm going to get to this point in a bit, if you can supply signage that would help, that's even better. So under that banner, as we supply signage, I think it's also important to pay attention to quality. And again, I am not about to disparage bottom right, somebody who hand writes a sign in the context of a global pandemic. Okay, that would just be rude. However, I do think we can all understand that well-designed signage, communicates a certain sense of quality and care and pride in place. And so if our Main Street communities can come alongside our restaurateurs and retailers to provide this kind of quality signage, or at least to encourage it, I think we're better off. One of the things that we noticed when we did design in the context of disasters, particularly hurricanes, is when there's a closed sign on a business, in the context of disaster, you're always asking this really awkward question. Are they closed for the day, or are they closed for good? And so these kinds of signs may be necessary in the temporary, just to make sure people know that we're not only not closed for the day, we're open today and we're open for business for good. And I love what Main Street Arkansas, the statewide coordinating program, did on behalf of all of their member communities. They not only said that our downtowns are open, but they had these really important messages. Top left says, Main Street Arkansas family, because family is always open. And bottom right, when you feel comfortable, come find shelter in a place that feels like home. And I love what they did, and Jay alluded to this. Our messaging has to be very thoughtful in these times, because on one hand, we definitely want to be welcoming, but on the other, we still need to clearly communicate this message of caution and safety. And I think Main Street Arkansas navigated those waters extremely well. There's another body of signage, of course, it's just straight up safety graphics that we need to make sure we adopt proper social distancing. And while none of these are necessarily bad, I would humbly submit, as the illustration that Jay demonstrated, it provides us with an opportunity to offer community branding equity. Here you can see what Main Street Arkansas did. In their member communities, they can use these decals that are applied to sidewalks. And so not only do they look better, but again, it's just you begin to connect these dots, and Main Street Arkansas begins to attribute some brand equity. And again, when it comes to sort of this ubiquitous safety signage that we see, now there's no more excuse for quality. This is, Jay showed you some from the Michigan reopening. These 8 slides, 8 photos, 4 slides, are from Delaware. And Delaware is offering these signs free of charge to anybody who wants them. And by the way, I'm going to be providing you a link if you want to access this PDF. And so there's no excuse anymore for us to not have good quality signage that's informative, but it's not scary. Another way that we can address graphic communication has less to do with graphic design, as it has to do with straight up space layouts and planning. Our retailers are going to need us to come alongside them and help them navigate, how can I simultaneously display as much merchandise as possible and yet create safe social distancing atmospheres. And again, our Main Street programs, especially designers and design committees, are adept at this. Same holds true for restaurant seating layouts to help our retailers get as many patrons in their restaurants as they can, again, while still satisfying social distancing. And we may have to get creative and start looking at outdoor dining options and designs to sort of artificially replace or temporarily replace the lost seating capacity of our restaurants as they comply with the CDC guidelines. And so in this regard, I've included some references in a minute you'll see to either parklets or pedlets. And I think everyone's familiar with what a parklet is. A parklet is when you create a structure in a parking space in front of a restaurant or retailer to create either outdoor display areas, or in this case, obviously outdoor dining. A pedlet just inverses that. You keep the dining and the seating adjacent to the restaurant on the sidewalk, and you erect the pedlet to kind of divert the sidewalk traffic around the seating area. And so it just kind of depends on your local municipality as to which approach would be better. Now, here's the first of 3 resources, and I've made all of these available to you on a PDF with hyperlinks. All you have to do is click on these, and you can download any and all of these PDFs. The reason I like the San Marcos Parklet Manual is because it provides you as a Main Street program, if you want to appeal to your municipality to do this, and they haven't had experience in this before in their ordinances or whatever, they provide everything you need, including the application. But the most important word on that document is the word temporary. You know, I think one of the selling points that we have right now is, yes, these are ideas that we've been touting in Main Street circles for years. But now the desire to have these parklets and pedlets has less to do with just attractiveness and interaction as much as it's just a necessity to give our restaurants a fighting chance in light of so many seating limitations. This document from UCLA is in us Main Street architect circles. This is the Bible when it comes to the parklets. I mean, it has everything you possibly need: terminology, layouts, and I love this design section that even shows how to create parklets if you have diagonal parking as opposed to parallel parking in your downtown. Free of charge, they give you construction details for benches and for planters. They even show you how to structure and level these things, as well as how to sign them, depending on whether the parklets are instituted by the municipality, i.e. a public space, or by the private restaurant and retailers, i.e. a private space in a public space easement. So that's one body of things that we're good at, and I think that we can bring to the table in this immediate context is graphic communication to help our restaurateurs and retailers. But I think another thing that we tend to be good at is just graphic visualization. In other words, we oftentimes see potential in buildings and parks and open spaces long before the general public does. And to the degree that we can kind of lead to water, I think is a good thing. This is a nasty old building I worked on 2 years ago. This is what it used to look like. But thankfully, you know, looking through the eyes of Main Street, I saw the potential. I did this photo rendering, and thankfully it now exists in real life. And the point I want to make here is, don't underestimate the power of visuals that we can create. Moreover, if you can companion those visuals with what Georgia Main Street is doing right now, I love what they're doing. They're actually offering free facade design services during COVID. And that way, I mean, it's going to be a hard enough proposition anyway to ask, you know, a building owner to fix up their building now. But if you're going to do it, if you can at least alleviate one of those costs in terms of the, you know, hiring a designer, I think that's a really good approach. Now, the only thing I want to add to that conversation is, I think, again, I'm assuming your restaurants are doing the same thing my restaurants are here in South Carolina, is I think there's some new tools that we need to add to our toolbox when it comes to facade designs. And one of those, I think, is walk-up windows. Because anymore, we have plenty of our retailers, well, I should say restaurants, are delivering services through walk-up windows as opposed to entering into their dining rooms. And so how can we begin to enfold walk-up windows into sort of our traditional Main Street downtown storefront vocabulary? I think that's going to be a helpful and an important tool going forward. Similarly, you know, and thankfully, I would assume in Nebraska, your weather is a lot more accommodating than here in South Carolina when it's 700 degrees with 9,000% humidity. There are precious few days in the summer that we can open our doors and windows, but if we can, again, it's another way that we can distribute the space to give our restaurants more seating capacity in the short term. But to me, one important design consideration is, how can we make these look as good when they're closed as when they're open and when they're active? And then finally, again, the proliferation of safety shields. Going forward, and again, neither Jay or I have a crystal ball, but to Dr. Burke's comment, my strong hunch is that some of these temporary measures might end up becoming permanent long-term measures? I don't know, but if they do, I think Main Street would require us to say, all right, what would be the best design approach for some of these? Should it just be frameless like the top right, so it kind of goes away? Should it be framed in the bottom right to kind of go with the decor? Framed bottom left in wood to kind of match a different kind of decor? Those are just some of the questions that we Main Street architects are wrestling with right now. So that's the first point. The second point, best practices, is think small and don't underestimate the power of small. I'm a massive fan of vibrancy amenities. These splashes of color, such as flower baskets and bistro tables and chairs and umbrellas. But in the context of COVID, we need these things for two other reasons. The first reason is this. Coming out of this crisis, both our Main Street programs and our municipalities are likely to not have as much disposable money for major improvement projects as before. And so rather than concentrating on those big projects, let's focus on small insertions of color and interactivity that'll give us the biggest bang for the buck. Number two, the second reason is coming out of this crisis, we need to introduce, again, additional seating options. Bottom left is a park that I helped design. You can see we populated it recently with bistro tables and chairs, the plastic Adirondack rocking chairs, because we have restaurants flanking this park left and right. And so we want to create additional seating options for them that they didn't have to fund. I'm really proud of Pascagoula Main Street, Mississippi, which is one of the communities we served after Katrina. After they heard my presentation, they went out and they bought a bunch of picnic tables and umbrellas for the restaurant that's to the right in this picture. And again, I've provided you links to everything you saw in the previous picture, the tables, the chairs, the rocking chairs. You know, I'm going to strongly urge you in just a moment to consider funding some of these elements as a part of your Main Street incentives approaches. All right. This may sound rude, but I don't mean for it to sound rude. If I was in your shoes and you just heard Jay talk and now you're hearing me talk, and especially if you don't see us making eye contact, it could be really tempting, and I know because I do this, to multitask. If I could just ask for your undivided attention for about 3 minutes, trust me when I say this is going to be the most important part of my presentation. And it builds on what I just showed you and what I just said, the power of small. When I do my work around the country, and when it comes to making recommendations about facade grants, one of the things that I recommend in communities where they don't have a lot of money for facade grants, or the property owners lack capacity, is what I call facade component grants. And the key word there is component. And the illustration I like to use is Mr. Potato Head, and I just dated myself and how old I am. But think of our buildings like Mr. Potato Head. In and of itself, he's just this brown blob. But once you start sticking on the components, such as the arms and the eyes and the sunglasses and the mustache, then all of a sudden he takes on this character. And if you think about our buildings as sort of this blank canvas, the components that we stick on them to give them their uniqueness are things like the signs and the paint and the awnings and the storefront and the windows and the doors, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I'm advocating for quite often in my Main Street communities is don't try to do an overall building facade approach, because it's too expensive and people don't know what to do. Just fund 1 or 2 components per year, and that's all. For example, upper right in Beaufort, South Carolina, 2 years ago, all they did was awnings. They installed about 40 awnings. In the middle, Hartsville, South Carolina, right now, they're only doing a sign grant. Far bottom right, Conway did a slipcover removal grant. And what you've done is you've made the decision-making process for the property owner easy. Do I need a new sign or not? Do I need a new awning or not? And what it allows is your Main Street facade grant funds to be used on far more people's building than just 1 or 2 buildings per year. Now that I just gave you on an educational, a new, different facade grant approach, now I'm going to completely change the subject and bring it back to COVID. What I want you to ponder with me is, should we consider diverting the kind of funds that we normally put towards facade grants, and especially if you want to consider the new approach I just mentioned of facade component grants, would it not be prudent for this immediate crisis is to take that money, or money from a municipality, or money from the CARES Act, and fund COVID responsive component grants. Because if your restaurants are like mine in South Carolina, they can reopen with limitations on seating and social distancing, but they all have to have a hand sanitizer station. Many of our restaurants are adopting, upper left, the foot door pull. Obviously, almost all transactions are happening behind a plexiglass screen. We've already talked about the importance of we're open for business signage, or the kind of signage in the bottom left to navigate where to park and where to pull up and curbside dining. Imagine the power if your Main Street program funded some of these elements for your district restaurateurs and retailers. Just imagine the amount of goodwill your Main Street programs would receive. And again, especially given the fact that you have so many funding sources available for this that you normally didn't. Obviously, traditionally, you got the Main Street budget for facade improvements. You've got your municipal budgets. But now you can even divert CARES funding for some of these elements. And for less money, far less money than you would expend on signs and awnings and facade components, you will actually be responding to an immediate, tangible need that virtually every one of your restaurateurs and your retailers needs. Two massive shout outs. I've already given the one on the left a shout out, Pascagoula, but Mary Helmer and Main Street, Alabama deserve a massive shout out. After I gave this presentation 2 weeks ago at the 3-day Bender conference, you can see Mary literally took screenshots of my slides, and she appealed to a foundation. If you can read that inset box in red, they picked a town, and they were going to offer every one of these bullet points to 25 businesses in their downtown, a website, the foot door pull openers, a branded graphic package, a plexiglass shield, a hand sanitizing station, and experts to provide design services. And it got funded. So imagine the power of that one Main Street program. Every one of 25 of the businesses in downtown receiving these kinds of immediate needs that every business is having to respond to in the context of COVID. Last best practice is it's all about the economy. We've got to figure out ways to help our restaurateurs and retailers open up and thrive when they've been decimated for the last few months. So what can we do to give our restaurants a fighting chance? We've already talked about parklets, and I just want to highlight Tampa, Florida, and their Lift Up Local Economic Recovery Plan. Again, this PDF, the link is supplied in the resource document I gave you. They have targeted several districts within their downtown where there's a proliferation of restaurants and retailers, and they're closing them down either all or part or different times of the day to create what they're calling business recovery zones. Now, in my humble estimation, our Main Street districts ought to be the quintessential business recovery zones. And so my admonition to you is, if you feel like you need to address sidewalk animation, if you need to address parklets and pedlets, all you need to do is take the Tampa document, adopt it for your use, and appeal to your local municipality. Again, the key word here, I should have gone back to the opening slide for them, it's pilot program, which implies temporary. Now, if you're smart, and I know you are, you've probably noticed that we're going to introduce some conflicts here, because currently a lot of people are using the parking spaces to pull up for curbside pickup. But we've also just said we want to use these parking spaces for parklets and for pedlets. So what are we going to do, when everybody's competing for that same space? Well, different communities have done different things. They've timed it. They said, this side of the street this week, the other side next week, blah, blah, blah. I just want to make sure we don't forget about spaces in our downtowns that we sometimes forget about, and that would be the sides and the rears of our buildings. Jay showed a great alley photograph. Here's another one from Fort Wayne, Indiana. And never forget, if your alleys are a nice enough space, they can become great outdoor dining spaces for your restaurants without having them inside or in front of the business itself. I love what this taco restaurant did in Dallas in context of COVID. They strung up these banners, and you pull to the rear, and you can see they repainted their door. And this is where you pick up the food. So for this taco place, instead of curbside pickup being on the front side of their building, it's in the alley side of their building. And I want you to think about this. I would venture to say probably 98% or more of our restaurants, the kitchens are going to be in the backs of the building. And so in many ways, it makes a lot more sense to offer curbside pickup in the rear of the building anyway, and make it even easier on our restaurateurs. I think retailers may have as hard or a harder time in the reopening phase. And this was a question that Ben asked in one of the conferences, and it's a very complicated question. I'm going to translate it in common English, and it goes like this: coming out of COVID, if a guy historically, leased 3,000 square feet in a big old downtown building, and they lost that tenant due to COVID, the chances of them getting somebody to rent all 3,000 feet may be diminished. And so what can we do when we can't charge as much for the same space and people don't want as much space? What are some strategies that we can employ? This is one, and this could be a component grant you fund, is demising walls. Especially if the building, I think you all know by now, our quintessential downtown historic buildings were very narrow and very long, usually 25 to 28 feet, wide and then 100 feet deep. And the problem is if those are professional office spaces or storage spaces, then it creates a dead pocket on our sidewalks and our streets. And so the notion is, just like Jay talked about from Calera, Alabama, is crafting micro retail spaces by erecting a small building, a small space or a wall or a cubicle, so that we animate and activate the sidewalk, but we maintain the professional offices storage in the rear. On the right side, from Paris, Arkansas, the building on the far right in the brick with the black awning, it's a Christmas decoration shop. She also owned the brick building in the middle of the picture, and she was just using it for storage. And so we appealed to her, said, could we build a wall 15 feet or so back from your front window? You keep all your storage back there, but now we can introduce 1 or 2 micro retail spaces. She's like, great, sure. And so it was a win-win for everybody. Now, there are other ways to create micro retail than just building a demising wall. You can see the cubicles on the upper right, kind of the food hall methodology bottom right, just directing cubicles left. But I think we just need to begin thinking about how to subdivide our buildings in much smaller configurations to make it easier for our property owners to release them. And last but not least, just a couple of just random things that only have applicability in these unique circumstances, some for the private sector and some for the public. Man, if there's ever time to fix up your buildings, this is it. They're probably going to have the least amount of traffic in and out of their building ever. And so in terms of maintenance and repairs and painting, try to encourage your Main Street property owners to do it now. Similarly, if there's some code compliance issues, there's no better time. And especially if you do it without kind of as a part of a larger renovation, you can qualify for tax credits. And so the document that I referenced from Joe Lonizak gives you a reference to that. And then, of course, just fixing up the buildings in general. Last but not least is, what do we do in the public realm? We all have fallen in love with these really colorful, artistic, creative crosswalks, and yet we always get shut down by DOTs and municipalities because we can't shut the road down. There's too much traffic. Well, there's hardly any traffic right now. So if there's ever a chance to try out these ideas, this is going to be it. Similarly in the intersections. But there's just 2 points I want to make about this. Number one is, if you're going to attempt some of this, don't sell it from the standpoint of color and creativity and all that, even though that's true and that's a part of it. The real reason you want to do this is pedestrian safety and traffic calming. And last but not least, I read a quote the other day, and I know what he meant. He wasn't being pejorative about this. Just painting a crosswalk is not going to solve all of our COVID problems, but it is going to make a little difference. It's all about the people. We get that. But if we can invite them back to a very exciting downtown, it certainly is not going to help. If you considered a road diet, or in our case, this is a town I work in where we wanted to consider a mid-block crossing. So now in this age of minimal traffic, we've erected a temporary thing to try it out, see if people like it. We'll go back in later and make it permanent if they do. If you've ever wanted to toy bike lanes, this is the time to do it. Again, I can't commend the project in Tampa enough, because what they've done very ambitiously, they've actually shut down half of a street in order to give additional seating locations for their restaurateurs. When Jay was wrapping up his show, he talked about being the hub of district communications. And in a similar way, I want to encourage us as Main Street people to be the coordinators of some COVID-specific design issues. And one of the biggest is going to be parking. As I noted before, everybody is competing for this 9-foot space in this parking. For parking, curbside pickup, parklets, and pedlets. And so we've got to be very judicious about our parking resources. We need to sign them well so people know where they are, whether they're public or private. We need, in this age, one of the great byproducts of COVID is people are working together better than ever. So in this spirit of cooperation, now is the time in your downtowns to appeal to your houses of worship, to your banks and civic institutions, to your governmental buildings that only use their parking resources at certain limited hours. Go ahead and appeal to them to use some of those temporarily in the context of COVID. But if you do, be a good neighbor. Help them maintain those parking resources. And if there are necessary repairs, be a partner in paying. And of course, I'm preaching to the choir. How many times have we had merchants complain about visits into their building, and we find out the merchants or their employees are parking in front of their building? This is when we need to talk about friendly enforcement and just ensuring that we educate our Main Street entrepreneurs again. Guys, give the best parking spaces to our guests. Since we've already talked about these, I'm going to be super quick. I've said it before, I'll say it again. If you only have one source to go to in reopening, it would be Jay's website, Reopen Main Street. But obviously, I can't say enough good things about Tampa and what they're doing with their Lift Up Local Economic Recovery Plan. To me, it's a perfect model for what you may want to consider in Nebraska. And finally, obviously, don't ignore the Main Street site, Main Street's website, and especially their COVID resources, and especially the blog, where people are constantly updating what they're doing in their communities. So that's all I have to say today. I hope it seemed practical and accessible to you. I'm going to turn the floor back over to Elizabeth and Jay and others. But as I do, the only thing I want to contribute to that is while yes, we want to have Q&A, I also just want to have dialogue. And you probably have come up with solutions there in Nebraska that we haven't thought of. And so I know Jay, speaking for Jay, we would love to hear the creative solutions that y'all are doing there. So Elizabeth.
Yep, great. Thank you, guys. This was great information and very helpful. If you've got questions, Luke, you might want to go ahead and unmute folks so that if they want to ask questions verbally, they can do so. Otherwise, if you want to ask a question, use the chat box there at the bottom. And we'll open it up. Don't be shy.
So everybody should have the right to click unmute on themselves if they want to speak.
Yeah, if you see your name there in the box and you see the little microphone on the left, just hover up on the upper right of your box and unmute yourself to ask a question.
This is Michael Sothen with Main Street Beatrice, and don't really have a question that's come to mind quite yet, but just want to say thank you for your guys' examples, and haven't had a chance to look at the handout document, but definitely looking forward to perusing that more and exploring some of the links you shared. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, just a reminder for everybody in case you missed it, the handout from Randy was attached to the Zoom link that I sent out this morning. So if you missed that, you can just click on the little box and it'll download the file for you. Come on, folks, don't be shy.
Hey, we'll ask them a question.
Okay, good.
I'd love to know, in light of what you saw Jay and I present, when we illustrated certain issues or topics, it could have been a retail, it could have been a signage, it could have been a design. What have you all done in some of your communities that we want to be aware of that you've done that successfully navigated those waters, either for how are you handling events, how are you handling signage, how are you handling incentives, anything. Just we'd love to know what you guys are doing there in Nebraska.
You know what,
I think
I'll mention a community that's not on today, but Grand Island has been doing some work on instituting an entertainment district that will
Right.
further enhance outdoor capacity for their restaurants and bars and tap rooms and everything in the downtown. So that's one. It's a long-term process for them because of the having to go through state regulations and everything and passage locally. But that's something that they're looking at for the long term.
I see that Kathy from Menden asked about how the CARES Act money could be worked. Now, obviously, in that instance, it would be up to the actual business or property owner who had applied. And if they received CARES Act, and I am not an expert, again, remember, I'm just the design guy, but I know enough to be dangerous. And if you look on my my link, I have a link to Mississippi Main Street and their reopening videos. I know one of those videos created by Arnett Mudrow addresses specifically CARES Act funding and PPP. But I think there's a certain percentage of the PPP money that can be used towards physical improvements to the building. And again, it's a limited percentage, of course, because the primary purpose of that money is to maintain your employees, but that's how it would be used in that situation.
Yeah, and I think, and again, I'm like Randy, I'm not an expert here, but in terms of the CARES Act dollars, those are flowing, as I understand it, to the states, and it'll ultimately be up to each state in terms of how they administer those funds at the state level and then down to the local level. One thing I would mention is that there's a special provision as part of the Community Development Block Grant Fund to use certain dollars for COVID recovery efforts that could even contemplate the installation of hand sanitizing stations or hand washing stations in the public realm as one example.
Right.
Nebraska did put out, I think it's called Get Nebraska Growing. Elizabeth, you might be able to correct me on that, but they have recently launched that website. It's available through the Nebraska Department of Economic Development, and you can click on the links through the Get Nebraska Growing portion to read more on how the state of Nebraska will be distributing COVID-related small business grants.
Yep.
Correct.
Those of you that are Main Street Network members would have gotten an email from me either last week or the week before that has a link to that in there. And if you need that, I can resend it to everybody.
And Elizabeth, I want to prepare you in a good way and encourage you. And as another selling point for Main Street membership, one of the things that we observed, particularly on the Mississippi Gulf Coast after Katrina, obviously there was an influx of FEMA-related funding, but eventually it got routed through CDBG. And to Jay's point, when the state of Mississippi looked around and asked the question, who knows what are the exact and precise needs in each of these coastal communities, the resounding answer was Mississippi Main Street. And so they became the funding agent for those funds in round one. And because the disaster recovery planning and implementation was so successful, guess who they turned to in round two? Mississippi Main Street. And then when the BP oil spill happened in the Gulf Coast, guess who they turned to again? And so there's some very tangible benefit from being aligned with an agency devoted solely to knowing the precise needs of your downtowns and your member communities. And so don't be surprised at all if you get a call and, hey, help us disperse CARES funding, because again, you've got your ear, hand on the pulse, ear to the ground, boots on the ground, whatever cliche you want to use. You kind of have an insider track on best use of those funds.
Yep, absolutely. We've got a question from Melissa. Do either of you have a system or survey to identify needs when a community may not know where to start?
Jay does.
The answer is yes, and it could be a different tool depending on the nature of Melissa's question. For example, we're working with Main Street Iowa right now to prep a survey that will be targeted at the community to better understand how they're feeling and how they might respond to the different phases of reopening. So there's that part there. And it depends on whether we're looking for the community's perspective and trying to understand better their concerns and how we might address those, or if we're looking for input from the businesses, that would obviously be a different tool. I feel like if it's the latter, if it's the businesses, there's probably already some pretty good information to work from based on some of the studies that the National Main Street Center has done.
Agreed.
Okay, does anybody else have questions? Yeah,
Oh, and Elizabeth, if I can. Melissa, if you'd like to see an example of what we're working on with Main Street Iowa right now, don't hesitate to reach out, give me a call or send me an email, j@downtownpros.com.
Okay, I've got a question from somebody else. We're in the process of a street renovation. Is there anything long-term we should add to our streetscape that would help with COVID-19?
Wow, that's a loaded question. Boy, I wish I had a crystal ball. Okay, so here's off the top of my head, my first qualifying answer is I have no idea, because no one knows where temporary recommendations are going to land eventually, in terms of social distancing and things like that. However, there are some best practices for streetscape design that benefit the pedestrian, that benefit traffic calming, that I think also would benefit COVID. And some of those would be more regular bump outs, particularly at a minimum at a mid-block crossing, because one of the things that causes the motorist to drive faster than your desired speed limits in your downtown is, what are they doing? They're trying to beat, they just left the light at this intersection, they're trying to beat the next light. And so they're viewing that entire block as a drag strip, basically. Whereas if you can subdivide that block, then it's going to feel like a shorter distance, and they aren't going to try to get up to speed. Not to mention the fact that you've put an impediment out close to them. The thing that calms traffic faster than anything, no pun intended, is placing objects as close to the vehicles as possible, whether it's parked cars, bump outs with trees and things of that nature. The advantage of those bump outs is if we can get our patrons accustomed to them, then adding additional bump outs in the future, either for the purpose of parklets or pedlets, won't feel like a stretch. One of the things that I'm curious to find out is, and I just have a hunch, it's an uneducated hunch, is I have this hunch that once people see and enjoy parklets, they're going to want them to remain. And so that's probably about the only one. Jay, can you think of any other things from a streetscape perspective?
The only thing that immediately comes to mind, and again, my crystal ball is as good as Randy's and as good as yours. But if your district is one where you do have a high level of pedestrian activity and where you frequently do host larger events, maybe the idea of installing a more permanent hand washing station, much like what you might see outside of a petting zoo area, is probably,
it's a good idea.
This would probably be the opportune time to think about that.
Yeah, really good. And to whoever asked the question, I will fire off an email hopefully later today to the architects listserv. And if they come up with any other additional better ideas than we just brainstormed, I'll redistribute those via Elizabeth.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, Renee was the one that asked the question, and she's actually one of my board members and is from one of our network member communities. So
good.
Helpful for everybody. I think, these projects continue on despite COVID. And
well, it's one of those weird things where in some ways you could argue this is the best possible time to do a streetscape.
Yeah, and it's funny too, because in this particular community, I've been talking to their board president, of their downtown association. And she said, you know, despite all that's going on, the complaints have kind of slowed up with the streets being dug up and the sidewalks and accessibility and that sort of thing.
Well, and because, you know, they say irony is pretty ironic sometimes, I can just tell you that we have been doing, helping communities prepare for streetscape projects for a number of years. And some of the very ideas that you find on the Reopen Main Street website actually come from the Preparing for Streetscape or Preparing for Construction handbook as well.
Yeah. Anybody else have questions? I don't seem to see any. I will be sending out a follow-up email with everybody tomorrow. That way, if you need to connect and ask further questions, we can get those passed along, or you can contact Randy or Jay directly. Again, thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate the information, and it was really great information. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Great. Thanks,
Thank
Elizabeth.
you.
Appreciate it, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.